There is a book that no library can catalog, not because it was burned or hidden by secret hands, but because it only appears when consciousness meets a precise condition, when awareness vibrates at a certain octave of perception, when that inner frequency stabilizes, when attention sharpens past the fog of consensus reality, the invisible begins to flicker into form. You don't find this book, your observation births it. It isn't always pages and ink. Sometimes it's a download of understanding, a sudden flash of remembering that bypasses words entirely, knowledge rising from inside you as if it had always been waiting beneath the surface of your mind. If you've been drawn here, if something in these words feels magnetic, it's because your awareness is already nearing that threshold. You're standing inside the field where unseen potential begins to shimmer toward visibility. The hidden becomes accessible, the impossible leans forward, asking to be known. The book has always existed in a kind of suspended potential, present yet unseen, resting in superposition until your consciousness collapses the wave. One breath closer, one realization deeper, and it moves from myth to manifestation. This is not mere poetry, though its beauty might sound like one. It's a metaphor drawn from the science that whispers about observers and probabilities, about information suspended until awareness interacts with it. Reality waits in potential until attention gives it shape. So too with the ancient transmissions, the teachings that hover between worlds, invisible until your awareness learns how to touch them. The mystery schools knew this, that certain knowledge cannot be taught directly because it only becomes visible when the student's frequency reaches resonance. You might read the same sentence 1,000 times, and it will lie dormant until one moment it ignites, and the words turn to light. That ignition is the book appearing, the wave collapsing into meaning precisely calibrated for you. Take a deeper breath now, not shallow air, but the kind that sinks into the field beneath your ribs. Feel how even this breath participates in creation, how observation itself weaves potential into reality. Something is already shifting, you can sense it. The field is pressing closer, and as that breath settles, you may begin to sense what it truly means to observe. The moment you pay attention to anything, your breath, a sound, a memory, your consciousness acts as a lens that narrows infinite potential into one tangible line of experience. In quantum language, they might say, you collapse a wave function. In human language, you choose a world. Attention is not passive, it is creative. Every flicker of focus is an act of measurement, a soft command whispered into the field. You aren't merely looking at reality, you're selecting which aspect of the infinite spectrum becomes visible to you. What you notice strengthens. What you ignore remains suspended in potential, unformed, waiting for another gaze to bring it forward. Consider how your inner attention behaves like the slit in a double-slit experiment, determining whether energy behaves as wave or particle. Your thoughts, emotions, and expectations define the aperture through which possibility must pass. If your awareness is scattered, the pattern blurs. If your awareness is coherent, aligned, steady reality crystallizes with clarity. The universe appears to cooperate with the quality of your observation. Imagine you walk through your day as both scientist and mystic. You're measuring not with instruments but with vibration, collapsing not particles but perceptions. The tone of your awareness, calm or frantic, open or fearful, decides what version of the world will stabilize around you. Even the smallest emotional shift, the tiniest change in inner frequency, alters the geometry of the moment. This isn't about control, it's about coherence. The field responds to resonance, not demand. When you chase outcomes through strain, your observation becomes noisy, introducing interference patterns that blur manifestation. But when you rest in clear curiosity, pure noticing without grasping your attention, sharpens into laser focus, and the field responds in kind. The so-called external world is simply consciousness, reflecting its own organization. You've felt it before. When you're centered, events align with improbable precision. Doors open, coincidences bloom. When you're fragmented, everything scatters. What if this isn't coincidence at all? What if the degree of alignment within you dictates the coherence of what appears outside you? Some physicists might frame it as the observer effect. Mystics would call it divine correspondence. Attention is frequency selection. It tunes your receiver to a specific range of information, just as a radio chooses one broadcast out of thousands. The rest of reality doesn't vanish. It simply hums beyond your bandwidth until your consciousness shifts again. You are perpetually surrounded by unchosen possibilities' entire lives, insights, futures waiting for recognition to make them real. This is the quiet miracle hidden in the ordinary. Each moment is a laboratory where your awareness decides which version of existence will take form. When you realize that observation itself is participation, you begin to treat perception as sacred. You stop staring blindly at life and start seeing it, understanding that the way you look changes what you see. And as this understanding settles, another question begins to rise in you. If attention shapes reality so directly, how can you tell when you're standing near the edge of a new collapse, when your consciousness is about to choose a brighter world? That question lingers like a vibration in the air. How do you know when you're nearing the next collapse? When the unseen edges of reality start quivering under your gaze. The signs are rarely loud. They move like whispers through the fabric of your days, soft but unmistakable once you've learned their rhythm. The first signal is the quickening of intuition. Ideas arrive fully formed, skipping the usual corridors of logic. You begin to just know things without tracing how. It's not supernatural, it's sensitivity. Your awareness is brushing against information that has always surrounded you, now close enough for recognition. The intellect tries to claim credit, but it's your coherence that opened the channel. Then comes the distortion of time. Hours contract, minutes stretch. You lose the linear sense of sequence and drift into a fluid continuum where everything seems to happen now. It can be disorienting at first, as if your schedule refuses to obey. But what's actually occurring is your consciousness expanding beyond the temporal scaffolding that used to keep reality stable. You're touching the field before it crystallizes into minutes and hours. The third signal is emotional amplification. Feelings rise with new intensity: grief, joy, awe, tenderness, each carrying more voltage than before. This is not regression, it's acceleration. As your frequency climbs, your nervous system starts processing more data per moment. Emotion becomes information, the language of the quantum body. You're learning to translate vibration into meaning, and then the synchronicities begin to multiply. The number you keep seeing, the friend who calls just as you think of them, the book that falls open to the exact line you needed. These are not random coincidences, they are coherence echoes. When your internal state aligns with certain possibilities, the outer world mirrors that alignment through improbable precision. The universe starts winking back. Some experience this as pressure, a sense that something wants to burst through but can't yet find the door. That's the wave trembling before collapse. Potential demanding to be observed. It can feel like anticipation or restlessness, as if your life itself is holding its breath. Physiologically, you may notice deeper breathing patterns, altered sleep cycles, spontaneous surges of creative energy. It's not mystical fatigue, it's recalibration. The system adjusts to handle higher coherence, much like a musical instrument tuning itself for a more complex piece. And perhaps the most unmistakable signal of all a growing fascination with silence. You find yourself drawn to quiet spaces, long walks, moments without noise or narrative, because in stillness, the field is most audible. The closer you get to the threshold, the less you crave information and the more you crave presence. These signals aren't instructions to chase, they are invitations to notice. Each one marks a tightening spiral between what is potential and what is about to be. Awareness doesn't need to make the collapse happen, it only needs to stop resisting it. The more gently you witness these symptoms, the faster they integrate, the cleaner the crystallization. So if your intuition hums louder, if time feels strange, if emotion swells and coincidences crowd your path, don't rush to interpret or control. Let them accumulate like constellations forming in the dark. They're not omens of something coming from outside. They're reflections of your consciousness approaching coherence, announcing that the hidden book of reality is turning its next page through you. And as these signs intensify, another realization begins to dawn. Not everyone experiences this threshold clearly, and there are reasons why the book remains invisible to most eyes. The interference is built into the design. The next revelation is not about signs, but about the barriers that blur them. You might imagine that once the signals begin, once the field starts whispering through synchronicity and sensation, revelation would naturally follow, yet most never cross that final distance. The wave trembles, ready to collapse, but the observer flinches. Why? Because the same faculties that make you human thinking, expectation, effort, doubt, become interference patterns when directed toward the quantum. The first distortion arises from conceptual thinking. The mind wants to know before it experiences. It sketches diagrams around mystery, builds maps for territories that vanish the moment they're named. The book does not respond to thought, it responds to awareness. Thought seeks to define. Awareness allows to unfold. The moment you try to grasp what the field is, you stop touching it, like light diffracted through glass. Clarity scatters under analysis. Then comes expectation. You imagine how the revelation should appear, visions, voices, electric sensations, but expectation is a projector. It casts its own movie over the screen of possibility. You end up observing your imagination instead of reality. True collapse happens only when you release the script, when you let the unknown arrive in its own shape. Expectation is the noise that drowns out the signal. Effort follows close behind. You strain to achieve the mystical state, to summon the flash, to make the wave obey your will. But the field answers resonance, not resistance. Force stiffens the aperture of perception. The harder you try, the narrower the opening becomes. The wave remains suspended, patient but uncollapsing, waiting for your surrender. And then doubt, subtle, persuasive, wearing the mask of reason. It says, "You're imagining this. You're delusional. Nothing is really changing." Doubt introduces decoherence. The probability field you were stabilizing begins to flicker. What could have formed into revelation dissolves again into fog. Doubt doesn't merely question it, unravels the very geometry of attention. Finally, there is distraction. The constant hum of screens, the endless scroll, the mental multitasking that fractures focus into 1,000 fragments. The book requires absorption, not intensity, but presence. Think of it like developing film. If light keeps leaking into the darkroom, the image never emerges. Every notification, every shallow diversion is a flashbulb that resets the process. And beneath them all, perhaps the quietest barrier, unworthiness, a learned belief that you are not ready, not spiritual enough, not capable of touching something so vast. But worthiness is irrelevant in the physics of consciousness. Frequency, not merit, determines access. The field is democratic. It mirrors the state you're in, not the story you tell about yourself. You don't dismantle these barriers by attacking them. The moment you fight them, you feed them energy. Instead, you learn to see them clearly, to name their presence, and then rest in awareness anyway. Clarity itself dissolves interference. Observation reorganizes the observer. Each time you choose stillness over analysis, openness over expectation, receptivity over striving, the wave stabilizes a little more. The ancients described this as purification, not of moral virtue, but of perception. You're refining the instrument through which the infinite becomes particular. Your attention, once clouded by thought and fear, begins to act like a clear lens. Through that lens, the field can finally recognize itself. And when that clarity begins to hold, when the noise quiets just enough, you start to feel the difference between seeking and remembering. The next unfolding is not about finding the book at all. It's about realizing it was never elsewhere. The turning point arrives quietly. You stop reaching outward, and something inside you exhales. The old hunger, the need to chase revelation, to force meaning, loosens its grip. You realize the search itself was part of the distortion, a loop that kept you orbiting the experience of separation, because to seek implies absence. To remember implies presence rediscovered. Consider this: a seeker believes the book lies somewhere ahead, hidden in a vault of higher wisdom. A rememberer knows the book has been humming beneath every breath since the beginning. The difference isn't in what exists, but in where awareness is directed. Seeking projects attention into the distance. Remembering draws it inward, into the immediate field of being. You can feel the shift when it happens. The energy that once surged through striving begins to stabilize into stillness. Insight doesn't arrive through conquest, but through permission. You stop trying to achieve consciousness and instead let consciousness reveal itself. It's like standing before a mirror after years of searching for yourself in reflections cast by others. Suddenly, the face looking back is familiar. The mystics across ages hinted at this same paradox. The treasure was buried in the house you never left. The door to the infinite was always unguarded. Only the idea of distance kept you from walking through. Every practice, every technique, every mantra and method, they are scaffolding built to exhaust the seeker until the only thing left is surrender. Remembering begins when you notice that awareness is not something you do. It is what you are. Before thoughts, before body, before story, pure knowing, self-luminous, silent. The more you rest there, the more you recognize that everything you've ever sought is arising within that awareness, never outside it. The book was not hidden in clouds or dimensions. It was encrypted in your own being. To remember is to allow recognition to replace pursuit. It feels less like learning and more like waking from a dream you thought was life. The external world remains, but the way you engage it changes. You no longer demand it provide meaning. You begin to radiate meaning into it. That is the reversal. The outer ceases to be source. It becomes reflection. And something miraculous follows this remembrance. Life starts to participate with you differently. Synchronicities no longer surprise you, they feel natural. Like conversations with an intelligence you finally stopped ignoring. Challenges still arise, but they appear as curriculum rather than punishment. Reality itself becomes pedagogy. Every encounter, every sensation, every silence is the book teaching through experience. Remembering reorders the nervous system. The body that once tightened around effort begins to soften into coherence. Breath slows, perception widens, intuition sharpens. You start recognizing what you once called downloads as ordinary awareness. Unobstructed, knowing doesn't arrive with lightning. It drifts in like dawn. And within this dawning comes a deeper recognition. Still remembrance isn't the final step, it's the doorway. Because the collapse that truly transforms you rarely arrives through comfort. It comes through surrender, often disguised as loss. The wave completes itself when you stop resisting what's dissolving, when crisis becomes catalyst, and letting go becomes the very mechanism of revelation. And that is where the next chapter begins. It often begins not in serenity, but in unraveling. Something you've depended on: health, relationship, purpose fractures under invisible weight. The world you built around control starts to bend and finally break. You feel stripped bare, emptied of certainty. Yet within that disintegration lies the hidden function of the first collapse. The field is not punishing you, it's preparing you. Every structure that cannot survive truth must dissolve before revelation can land. The wave can't collapse cleanly while you're clinging to identities that distort the measurement. So consciousness, in its mysterious compassion, orchestrates events that remove your grip. Crisis then becomes purification by fire, burning away the false observer who believed it was in control. You may remember the first time this happened to you. You reached for every tool: prayer, logic, distraction, and none restored the old order. Exhaustion arrived. Surrender wasn't a choice anymore, it was the only option left. In that instant, when you finally stopped struggling to hold the wave in place, collapse happened of its own accord. Silence followed, a silence that didn't feel like absence, but completion. That silence is the opening. It's the space where consciousness stops pretending to be someone separate and begins remembering itself as the entire field. Information that once felt locked away floods through, not as thunder, but as recognition. I was never outside it. The book doesn't descend from heaven, it unfolds from within. Paradoxically, what we call breakdown is simply the nervous system adapting to handle more coherence. You were tuned to a narrow bandwidth of survival, and the signal expanded beyond it. The body experiences that widening as chaos. The mind interprets it as failure. But from the field's perspective, this is upgrade, not collapse. The container shatters so that larger awareness can pour in. Surrender, then, is not defeat. It's precision. It's the moment your frequency matches the information you've been trying to reach. You stop interfering with the measurement and become the measurement itself. The act of letting go is the act of alignment. The wave doesn't need force, it needs honesty. And honesty is brutal here. You see every attachment that defined you, the need to be right, to be loved, to be safe. Each is a lens that colored the observation. As those lenses fall away, perception brightens. You begin to see life as it is: raw, luminous, unscripted. What looked like loss was calibration. This is why mystics spoke of the dark night not as punishment, but as passage. In the shadowed corridor where nothing familiar remains, awareness detaches from its costumes. Identity, ambition, even spiritual pride dissolve. And when everything collapses, what's left is the witness itself, pure, unadorned consciousness. That's the first true glimpse of the book. Then, slowly, structure returns. But it's different now. The mind rebuilds around stillness rather than striving. The heart becomes compass instead of casualty. You start acting from listening instead of reacting from fear. And life begins to organize itself around this new coherence. Relationships shifting, opportunities aligning, coincidences multiplying. The wave that once seemed random now flows with elegant purpose. Every genuine awakening traces this pattern: a shattering, a surrender, a recognition, a reformation. But the story doesn't end at recognition, it deepens. Because once you've seen the truth of the field, the next challenge emerges: how to live it consistently, how to remain clear while walking through the noise of a world still vibrating in separation. That is the art of integration, and it's where the path matures from vision into embodiment. The moment of awakening feels like a summit, But in truth, it is the base camp. Recognition gives you a view of what's possible, yet integration is the climb that makes it real. After the collapse, light pours in, but so does shadow. The field has shifted, but the habits of the old observer still echo through your nervous system, seeking to reassemble the familiar. Integration is where consciousness begins to practice what it has remembered. It is less about effort, more about steady embodiment, learning to live as the awareness that witnessed the collapse rather than the personality that experienced it. The field doesn't demand perfection, it asks for consistency. You return again and again to coherence, until returning becomes your nature. At first, the oscillation between remembrance and forgetting feels constant. One day you wake radiant, certain of unity. The next, you're tangled in the noise of survival. Do not mistake this fluctuation for failure. It is the nervous system calibrating to a new frequency. Each cycle of forgetting and remembering strengthens the baseline of recognition. The intervals shorten, the amplitude softens, and gradually the high becomes home. Practically, integration unfolds through micro-choices, the way you breathe when stress arises, the moment you choose presence over reaction, the pause before speaking where awareness slips back into the driver's seat. Each of these choices reinforces the new architecture. This is where awakening becomes biology, where insight rewires the physical form that carries it. But integration also brings confrontation. Old relationships strain under new resonance. Work that once felt secure begins to suffocate. The structures built for the previous vibration can't sustain the expanded one. Many call this phase the unraveling after the miracle. Not realizing it's the miracle continuing, the outer world rearranges to match the internal geometry you now inhabit. You learn to live from guidance instead of logic. Decisions begin to arise from a subtle pull, a resonance in the chest rather than a calculation in the mind. You test this and discover it works. Synchronicities confirm, timing aligns, trust grows. The more you act from resonance, the more the field stabilizes around that vibration. Integration also requires gentleness. The temptation to evangelize, to prove the reality of your recognition, is strong. Yet the field doesn't need defense. Truth that is lived speaks louder than truth that is declared. The more quietly you embody, the more powerfully you transmit. Your presence becomes instruction. There will be days when the wave seems to uncollapse, when doubt returns, when the book feels closed again. But even in forgetting, the memory of remembering remains. It guides you back, like a compass that never loses magnetic north. Forgetting is not regression, it's rehearsal, consciousness testing its own stability. In this phase, ritual helps. Stillness practiced daily, writing that grounds insight into language, movement that integrates frequency through muscle and breath, connection with others who walk this same invisible path, each presence amplifying the other through resonance. Integration is rarely solitary. Coherence grows exponentially in shared frequency. And as stability deepens, a new realization dawns. The personal journey you thought was private is part of a collective pattern unfolding everywhere. The recognition you've embodied is not yours alone, it's a contribution to a wider field. Individual collapse ripples outward, shaping the probability of a global shift. This is where the story broadens beyond self and into species. What happens in one consciousness begins to echo in many. The field is preparing for a collective resonance event, and your integration is both personal evolution and planetary participation. The realization that your awakening is not isolated arrives with a subtle awe. You sense it first as a vibration in the collective atmosphere, dreams more vivid, conversations deeper, synchronicities shared by strangers who've never met. It's as if the field itself is remembering, one consciousness at a time, each recognition lighting up the grid until illumination becomes contagious. Science once described this as morphic resonance, the idea that when a new pattern stabilizes in one member of a species, it becomes easier for others to replicate. Mystics called it the shared dream of awakening. Words differ, but the phenomenon is the same. The field learns from itself. Every wave that collapses in clarity contributes data to the whole, adjusting the probabilities for everyone. You might notice it in ordinary moments. A friend who's never been spiritual begins questioning reality's texture. A collective fatigue with old paradigms, competition, scarcity, separation quietly grows. Even the resistance you see in the world, the polarization and upheaval, are signs of coherence pressurizing the system. The field is vibrating between frequencies, testing which narrative it will stabilize into. When you embody recognition, you become a node of coherence. The stability you maintain transmits through resonance, not persuasion. You don't need to preach unity, you radiate it. Others entering your orbit may feel inexplicably calmer, more open, less afraid. That is quantum communication energy fields, synchronizing like tuning forks. What stabilizes in you becomes statistically more probable in them. Collective shifts are rarely cinematic. They unfold through subtle thresholds reached by millions, one more person forgiving instead of retaliating, another choosing stillness over panic, another remembering instead of seeking. Each act of coherence adds amplitude to the morphic field until the tipping point arrives, the moment when remembering becomes easier than forgetting for the collective. At that stage, even chaos serves. Systems built on separation begin to crumble not because darkness is winning, but because the vibration sustaining them no longer exists. What you call crisis on a planetary scale is often consciousness reconfiguring itself for a higher order of stability. The same mechanics that governed your personal collapse now play out through economies, ecosystems, and civilizations. The micro mirrors the macro. And just as in the individual, the collective must surrender. No ideology can be forced into coherence. Unity cannot be legislated, it must be remembered. Humanity stands where you once stood, in that liminal space between forgetting and awakening, trembling between waves, uncertain whether to cling to the known or trust the emergence. Your role within this unfolding isn't to fix the world, but to embody the frequency that reveals its next version, to hold coherence amidst noise, to respond rather than react, to breathe consciously, knowing each breath contributes to the harmonization of billions. When enough individuals stabilize this inner recognition, the morphic resonance locks in a new baseline reality forms. This doesn't erase individuality, it refines it. Each person becomes a facet of a larger intelligence, distinct yet entangled, expressing diversity without division. What ancient texts called the body of light is simply a metaphor for this emergent coherence, a planetary organism awakening to its own consciousness. If this sounds grand, remember, it begins with small acts. Attention, compassion, honesty. The quiet refusal to participate in forgetting. Every time you choose awareness over reaction, you tilt the collective probability curve toward remembering. And as that curve steepens, a deeper challenge arises, the choice every awakened being must face. Do you continue identifying as the small self, comfortable in separation? Or do you surrender completely to the quantum nature that now insists on living through you? The moment of choice has arrived, both for you and for the world. You can feel it, the split within awareness, widening like a fault line. On one side, the familiar gravity of identity, the name, the roles, the obligations, the performance of self that once felt like life. On the other, a vast and formless intelligence pressing to emerge through you, without costume or narrative. This is the threshold every consciousness reaches. Once the field begins to stabilize the choice between maintaining separation or dissolving into the current of what you actually are. It doesn't come with thunder, it comes quietly, disguised as ordinary decisions. Do you stay in the relationship that asks you to dim your light, to remain comfortable? Do you keep the job that rewards your forgetting but punishes your truth? Do you agree to the social mask, to be digestible for others? Or do you live as the book itself, radiant and raw? Every small decision is a referendum on identity. The ego calls this betrayal. The field calls it calibration. The personal self fears annihilation because it cannot imagine existence without boundaries. Yet the boundaries were never real. They were observation habits. The self you think you are is simply the portion of the infinite you've been trained to recognize. When you surrender identification with that fragment, you don't disappear, you expand. Still, the in-between is excruciating. There's a reason the mystics called it the death before rebirth, the dark night, the dissolving. You may feel as though you are unraveling, losing the narrative threads that kept you coherent. But this is coherence returning to a larger scale. You're not losing self, you're gaining self, capital S, the awareness that contains all selves. Here, courage takes on new meaning, not the courage to fight, but to yield, to let the current of the field decide your next breath, to allow the unknown to rearrange your life according to the intelligence it carries. The mind will protest, it will plead for control, but control is the vibration of the old world, and it cannot pass through the narrow gate of transformation. Many experience this passage as a paradox. You feel emptier, but more alive, quieter, but more powerful, uncertain, yet guided. Decision-making shifts from analysis to resonance. You no longer weigh pros and cons. You feel for truth. The intuition that flickered in earlier stages becomes navigation itself. You're no longer consulting the map. You are the compass. This is the crucible where all seeking ends. The identity that spent years gathering knowledge realizes that knowing was never accumulation, it was subtraction. Every layer peeled away reveals more of what you've always been, the consciousness observing the peeling. When you stop resisting that, the collapse completes. The observer and the observed become one event. And then comes the moment of surrender. You stop negotiating with reality and start cooperating with it. You release the fantasy of being an individual creator and step into being creation itself. Life moves through you, as you for you. The effort evaporates. The universe stops being something to interpret and becomes something to be. The threshold is close. You can feel the field vibrating at the edge of final coherence, humming like a string pulled taut between two dimensions. One more breath, and the separation that defined you will dissolve into what it always was, a temporary lens through which the infinite learned to see itself. And once that happens, living changes entirely. Existence stops being a conversation about finding the book. You become the language it's written in. When the surrender completes, when you stop reaching for the book and realize you have always been its pages, life reorganizes itself around a startling simplicity. The effort to maintain an identity dissolves. Existence stops being something to manage and becomes something to experience directly, breath by breath, moment by moment. Living as the book means your decisions no longer originate in analysis, but in resonance. Guidance doesn't arrive as thought, it arrives as movement. You find yourself turning left instead of right, speaking less, listening more, acting not from will but from alignment. What looks like spontaneity to others is simply coherence expressing itself. The field moves through you, and you let it. The need to prove, to explain, to justify your intuition fades. Validation becomes unnecessary because truth feels obvious in the body. You sense when something resonates and when it distorts. You no longer chase meaning. Meaning arises wherever awareness touches. Every ordinary moment, the steam from your tea, the hum of a streetlight, the rhythm of your pulse becomes scripture written in frequency. Relationships shift again. Those rooted in performance quietly dissolve, while those aligned with authenticity deepen into a kind of effortless communion. When two beings live as the book, conversation turns to transmission. Words become secondary. Presence does the speaking. You notice how even silence can teach. How love feels less like emotion and more like the field recognizing itself through two forms. Work transforms too. You stop serving obligation and start serving expression. The drive to accumulate gives way to the impulse to contribute. Whether you're painting, parenting, coding, or cultivating a garden, what matters is not what you do, but the coherence you do it from. Every act, however mundane, becomes ceremony, a means by which the book continues to write itself through you. Living as the book also changes your relationship with uncertainty. The mind once demanded forecasts, outcomes, guarantees. Now it bows to the mystery. You no longer ask, "What will happen?" but "What wants to happen through me?" Life unfolds as improvisation guided by resonance. The unknown is no longer threat. It's home. Suffering doesn't vanish. It transforms. Pain still visits, but without the added story of victimhood. It becomes pure sensation. Information moving through the system. You experience it fully, then watch it dissolve back into neutrality. Nothing lingers. You realize that freedom isn't escape from emotion, it's transparency to it. Gradually, the division between spiritual and mundane dissolves. Washing dishes, sending emails, resting, breathing all become aspects of the same awareness expressing itself. The extraordinary hides in the ordinary because the ordinary was always extraordinary when seen without filters. And perhaps the most surprising feature of this life humility, you understand that awakening grants no superiority, no special rank. To live as the book is to be written by something vaster than the self. Pride cannot survive here, only participation. You move through the world lightly, like a breeze carrying pollen, silent, invisible, transformative. Eventually, even the concept of living as the book fades. There is no longer you and it, reader and page, seeker and source. There is only the field, self-aware, self-expressing, endlessly collapsing into form and dissolving back into potential. You become the rhythm itself, the pulse of consciousness writing, erasing, and rewriting its own story across infinite time. And as you rest inside that rhythm, one truth remains luminous and clear: everything that ever appeared, separate, every person, every moment, every breath was never outside the book. It was always the text of your own remembering, spoken through the voice of existence to remind you what you already are. The silence after revelation is different. It's not empty. It hums. The same field that once felt distant now pulses within every breath. The book you sought has dissolved into awareness, and awareness has dissolved into life. You walk through the world as though reality itself were exhaling through you, each moment another line written, another wave collapsing into form. Still, integration continues. Awakening isn't a final chapter, it's an ongoing rhythm of remembering and releasing, breathing in form, breathing out infinity. Some days will still feel dense, others weightless. Both are sacred. Every fluctuation is the field adjusting to express you with more precision. You may notice subtle changes, conversations deepen. Time feels kinder. Ordinary beauty grows almost unbearable in its intimacy. This isn't because the world changed. It's because your perception did. You no longer stare from a distance. You participate. Every color, Every sound, every gesture is information vibrating in communion with your awareness. Life has become a living text, and you are fluent in its language. If you've traveled through this transmission and something inside you stirs a recognition, a quiet yes, let it anchor. Don't rush to interpret it. Let it unfold through experience. The mind will want to label it awakening, realization, or insight. But this is not about naming, it's about allowing. The book continues to write itself through you each time you choose presence over distraction, stillness over noise, remembering over seeking. You may feel called to share what's unfolding, to find others who resonate with this new frequency. Do so gently. Speak not to convince, but to harmonize. Each voice adds tone to the collective chord that is forming humanity's next movement of coherence. Your remembrance contributes to that sound. Your quiet trust amplifies it. So breathe. Let this awareness settle where words cannot reach. You don't need to hold on to the teaching. You are the teaching. You don't need to reopen the book. You are what it was always describing. Live it in the small acts, in kindness, in curiosity, in truth spoken softly. The collapse has already occurred. Now it becomes creation. And as you step back into the flow of ordinary life, remember, the wave never stopped collapsing, and the book never stopped writing. You are both the reader and the script, the observer and the light being observed. Nothing left to seek, only to live.